As global leaders face many challenges as they gather for the G20 meeting today in Pittsburgh, but the biggest one may be whether or not the world's leaders can trust each other. After agreeing at the summit last November to refrain from raising trade barriers during this economically sensitive time, nearly all major nations have implemented protectionist policies, according to Global Trade Alert. Here to discuss that and many other issues that we are facing in Pittsburgh, in Washington, Carla Hills, former U.S. trade representative, now CEO of Hills & Company, Colin Bradford, also there, a former World Bank economist and now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And joining me here in the studio, economist Roger Kubarych, a senior fellow at, well, we just call it the Council when we're in the know, but the Council on Foreign Relations. Roger, let me start with you. What's your take on the mini trade war or maybe the conflict that has been started with the tires and chickens by the president here? Is it going to escalate into a full-scale problem?
I don't think so, because I think the U.S. position will be to try to make it into a legal rather than a policy development. Namely, China signed up to a piece of legislation, mutually agreed, back in the late 90s so that they could get into the WTO, and it had what we called a surge protector. And this surge protection is really not conditioned on bad behavior by the Chinese. It's just done by the numbers. And so our lawyers in the STR and International Trade Commission have said the numbers are too big, the surge is having a negative impact on the industry, and we have justified under that law applying that law to raise tariffs.
Carla, I don't know if you think it's within his legal rights or not, but regardless, I do know that you don't feel it's exactly the right time to bring this up.
I think the timing is unfortunate, although this is a 421 case. That isn't the issue. The communique in November and the communique in April for the G20 solemnly pledged not to raise trade barriers during the year 2009. And to do it just on the eve of the G20 on our territory, Pittsburgh, I think is a mistake. If we can't live up to our promises, are we to expect others to live up to their promises? So I hate the timing, even though the lawyers can say, well, it's really not a breach of the WTO rules. That is the World Trade Organization.
Colin, what do you think? I mean, you don't think that we'll see a big burst of protectionism here, but we certainly have seen more than nothing, right? I mean, since last November, we've seen, according to Global Trade Alert, 70 trade policies, harmful measures, in their opinion, per quarter implemented, and we're going to see another 134 in the second half.
Yeah, but you don't see a sweep of serious surges in trade protection. To take a contrary view, I mean, I think the summit is being held in Pittsburgh, after all, with a big media market in Ohio, where jobs have got to be the absolutely top of the item of the agenda for most of the people in that region and for many people around the world. So I think to see selective moves like this that are legally based, that are within the realm of the general trade agreements and legal norms that we've got, is neither surprising nor necessarily alarming.
All right, so Colin, what do you think we're going to see as far as a focus then? I mean, if jobs are not completely related to this trade problem, what do you think we're going to see as a focus coming out of the G20?
Well, I think that the new issue that wasn't touched in London was this whole set of global imbalances between the U.S. and China, where the Chinese are doing excessive savings and we're doing excessive consumption. We're driving a trade deficit. Their savings is driving a trade surplus. There's a huge interest on the part of all the leaders, except for perhaps Angela Merkel, who faces elections on Sunday in Germany. There's a huge interest on the part of all leaders to use this recovery as a means of restoring a different global structure to the trade surplus and trade deficit countries.
All right, so let me go to the senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations here. It sounds like a good issue for you to deal with. I mean, you lived in Germany for one thing, but what do you do about global imbalance issues? I mean, you can't really legislate a change, right?
Well, the Chinese come here and they say, we're a patient country. We know that we have an unsustainable surplus. You're an impatient country. You know you've got an unsustainable trade deficit, but you don't want to take any immediate measures to do anything about it, and you think that we can solve your problem for you. Together we'll solve the problem, but let's take 5 or 10 years to do it. So there's a lot of sense in that. It's not that easy to get the Chinese to move, and it's almost impossible to make a big dent in that bilateral imbalance overnight. I really think it will take 5 years.
And Carla, these issues don't sound terribly unrelated, really, do they?
No, they really don't, and I think we should be talking to one another. China's surplus has come down about 50% over the last year. Our deficit's come down about 50% over the last 2 years, and so we're moving in the right direction. I agree with the suggestion that it'll take time. In fact, it would be against our economic interests if we were to make the adjustment in a matter of months.
You don't believe that time is the enemy of reform here, as the Treasury Secretary said the other day?
I think that we got to get on with it. What worries me is when we pledge to do things, whether it is to have the IMF monitor our economic behavior, I think we should live up to our pledges. And there will be a cynicism and a lack of regard in the investment community at large if we don't. What we want to do is encourage a growth in our economy, and that is going to require private investment. And if we pledge to do a certain course of action and then we fail to do it, I think that's a mistake.
All right, hang on 1 second. We're going to take a quick break here on Bloomberg Television. We will come back and talk more with our G20 roundtable. Colin, Bradford, and Carla Hills there in Washington, D.C., and Roger Kubarych here in New York. We continue our G20 discussion in Washington with Carla Hills, former U.S. Trade Representative, now CEO of Hills & Company, Colin Bradford, former World Bank economist, now Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and Roger Kubarych, here in studio, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. I want to talk, first of all, about the coordination that's necessary as far as the stimulus. And you all think it's a no-brainer not to pull back as far as stimulus is concerned too early, and that we've got to have a concerted effort here. Colin, let me ask you to start. Do you think that we're going to get actual tangible results out of this conference?
Yeah, I think what you have to look at, though, is it's very important, I think, for markets and people involved in markets to not just look at this one event or the London summit in isolation, but a whole process that's involved here with finance ministers, central bank presidents, and deputies in the G20 process over time, where they're sharing information. I mean, what's really happened now after this financial crisis is you've reconstituted the Global Steering Committee for the world economy into the G20 rather than the G8. So it's a larger group, but not an unwieldy one. It's one that's been meeting over the 10-year period since the Asian crisis. And I think what you'll see is lots of communication, lots of concerted effort, and an effort to coordinate how they come down off of this in terms of monetary and fiscal policy so that you don't get more inflation in the out years.
Do you think it's important, Carla, do you think the concerted effort is as important here as when we're talking about stimulus and an exit strategy?
Absolutely. I think that you don't want to pull back too fast on the stimulus, but each country may have a different speed ratio and move a little bit differently, and coordination is highly important. And one group of institutions that weren't mentioned earlier are the international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. The IMF is the organization that I would expect to monitor some of the movements forward. I mean, after we get out of the crisis, how do we have a handover from government stimulation, government ownership to ordinary economic behavior? And I think we have to have an agreement, a framework to move forward.
One of the things this G20 summit will show is the success of China in using activist fiscal policy. There was a debate, and an honest debate, between those who didn't think that stimulus would work at all and those who felt that the Obama administration in particular didn't do enough. And the Obama administration wanted Europe to do more. And there's China, without any pressure, without really being part of that debate, really dumping a lot of stimulus and a lot of credit growth. There was a bigger increase in credit growth than there was in GDP. And it's worked. I mean, there's a tremendous increase in the growth rate. The whole fear of a cumulative decline is out the window. Stimulus works, and China has proved it. And that
it's much easier for them to dictate the things they do.
Well,
since it's...
well, that's right. They don't have a Congress that it takes forever to make up its mind. But implementing what they did was no easy matter. And so implementation is not done by parliaments, it's done by the bureaucracy, and they did it well. And they will therefore have much more self-confidence about basically pushing, we are doing things that other emerging market countries can follow.
Let me find in the financial regulation area too, where the Chinese have stronger oversight, monitoring, supervision, and regulation of financial institutions and more ownership of them as well. So they represent a different model where government intervention isn't a bad thing as it's perceived often in Anglo-Saxon countries, and hopefully we're changing our perspectives on that.
Do you think we are, Carla?
Yeah, I do. I think that's exactly...
I may not hope that we change our perspectives quite as much as the gentleman who just said that. I would hope that we would get back so we would have real market economy.
All right, well, it's a discussion that we could obviously continue, and we will. Here offline. We've got to take a break, though, here on Bloomberg TV. When we come back, airline stocks have been performing. And let me say thank you to Roger, to Carla, and Colin. Thank you so much for joining us. I jumped the gun a little bit there. It was great to have you all here together. Now